Good afternoon and welcome to yet another episode of the Black Archive Visual Podcast, episode 6, which is made possible by the Harvard South African Fellowship Program, run through the Center for African Studies at Harvard University. For exciting events and all things Africa at Harvard, I encourage you to visit our website at www.africa.harvard.edu. Detailed information on opportunities for fellowships, funding for undergraduate and postgraduate programs, as well as exciting research and public engagement listings can be found on our website. I am Sisego Kumalo, your host and a visiting fellow of the Harvard South African Fellowship Program, a lecturer of philosophy at the University of Fort Hare in South Africa, where I teach on social and political philosophy, feminist and queer theory, decoloniality, and the Black Archive. And today, my guest is Professor Pamela A. Mason, who holds a doctorate in education and is a co-chair of the Literacy and Languages Concentration and director of the Jeanne Chall Reading Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Mason's professional and research interests encompass the role of culturally sustaining pedagogy in promoting literacy, achievement, the interaction of text complexity and background knowledge, qualitative and quantitative literacy assessment, and the efficacy of the roles of reading specialists and literacy coaches. Pamela has extensive experience as a reading, language, arts curriculum coordinator, and she also was an effective elementary school principal serving in both urban and suburban districts in the Boston area. Mason collaborates with colleagues nationally and globally on preparing reading specialist teachers and literacy coaches, developing the capacity of school leaders as literacy advocates, and evaluating school-wide literacy programs. Pamela, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
Welcome to this episode. I want to start us off possibly with diving into an area of perception, really. And I quite like the fact that you have both local as well as global sort of perspective and reach in terms of the work that you do, familiar as well with the South African context. And I think it's so apt that we're having this conversation just as, for example, the South African basic education system has released the national senior certificate results. And the public perception that often comes about is that the literacy levels in developing countries are quite low, right? Whereas when, for instance, one looks at the UNESCO, the UNESCO report that came out in 2017 on literacy, you find, for instance, that countries like Botswana, Eswatini, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Angola are in the region of about 70 to 75% of literacy rates, both in terms of adult literacy in any case. So I wonder where the perception of high illiteracy rates in the developing world come from your perspective, right? And whether or not that perception feeds into the ways in which we approach, for example, how we think about literacy, both from the developed world's perspective, but also the developing world. I know that's a big question to start us.
It's a big question. But I think that it's apt that we start at perception and then move into reality. Part of how we build those perceptions is around assessment. Like, how do we know people, children, adults, know how to read and write? And then so we have to interrogate, how do we get that data and what do the assessments look like? In the global South, we're dealing with cultures in which multiliteracies is the norm.
Yeah.
So that we are looking at outcomes on these assessments, either in mother tongue or in the language of wider communication, that kind of cross cuts what these learners know. So there may be the mother tongue that's spoken at home and within the family unit, which may be similar, the same, or different from the community language, which again may be the same or different than the language of instruction in primary education. So we're talking about people who know a lot of languages, and so at the points in which they are assessed, they may not be totally comfortable, versed in the language of the assessment. And even here in the United States, where we tend to be, for better or for worse, monolingual, we have learners who do not perform well on standardized assessments. And one has to ask the question, what are we testing? How are we testing it? And do the outcomes of these assessments really reflect the language facility and competency of the students who are assessed? So we need to think about those, because if you look at PISA, United States isn't way high up there. You know, we've got some challenges in light of all of our economic resources. We still have challenges around that assessment and how our learners are performing on that assessment. So the perceptions come from these national reports and international reports, but one wants to look back and say, okay, what is being assessed and how is it being assessed?
And I love the fact that you talk about, you know, in linguistics, for example, we would call it L1 versus L2 or L3, right?
Or L4
so,
or
exactly,
L5.
Exactly, right. So you have these different languages that an individual, a student, a learner will bring into the classroom, right? And I wonder what that says then about the ways, as you say, how we assess in the first instance, but maybe kind of being imaginative and proactive as a result in terms of how we design literacy assessments, not only for the school program, but also just in terms of being able to communicate on a daily basis, right? Because at the end of the day, I think the perception that says that we have either high or low literacy levels will impact the kind of opportunities that the schooling system, you know, the people that the schooling system produces, right? So, and I think this is one of the key challenges, and I think we're going to get into this later on in the discussion, but one of the key challenges that I always find to be a problem in the South African context is that there are certain learners who are taken to be more advantaged because of the kind of education that they've been subjected to, the kind of school programs that they've gone through, which then kind of gives them it's an unfair advantage, right? Especially looking at the histories. So I guess the question that I want to pose to you is to say, thinking about the perceptions, thinking about the realities around literacies, how do we innovate to include and maybe take seriously L2 through to L5, right? Is there a place for orality and orature in literacy discourses, I wonder?
Well, I think as in our classrooms, yes, there should be a lot of opportunities for learners to express themselves in reading and in writing and in speaking in multiple languages. In the United States, we call that translanguaging.
Yeah.
But those languages are all developing, continue to develop. So it becomes additive rather than subtractive. And so the learner's language skills. But then the assessment piece gets tricky. Because how do you assess this oracy and literacy in multiple languages in a timely fashion, in a consistent fashion? Because when you're testing, you're not teaching. And as they say, you don't fatten a cow by weighing it.
For sure.
So we do have these measures that are effective and efficient.
Yeah.
And then we can use them for comparative data. But when you get back into the cultural aspects of language, that it becomes more nuanced. So it's a hard question to answer because we do need to have these consistent measures. But I think it's contextualizing the results that's more important. You know, there's nothing wrong with the assessments in particular, but I think people put a lot more weight on them than maybe they deserve. But we also want to acknowledge that the cultural aspirations of people in the global South, that they want to have the economic advantages and the social advantages that everybody else has. And for better or for worse, that's defined in terms of
Lingua franca.
How well do they read and write in English? Can they function in English? And so therein lies the rub, that we want to have people very connected to their mother tongue and all the other languages in their community and value them, and then still provide them opportunities to learn English, which is considered the language of mobility.
For sure. And I think there are a couple of things for me that I'm fascinated by, right, in your response. The first of which takes me specifically when one thinks about orature and orality, right, and oracy. I love that concept. It's the first time actually that I'm hearing it, so thank you for adding to my vocabulary with that. When we're thinking about the function of orature, especially in the contemporary university, so let's step out of the classroom of the school classroom and think about the university context. One of the biggest challenges that the humanities are facing, and I'm inclusive of education when I'm thinking about the humanities, because the humanities, or education rather, is a very human discipline, right? So when I'm thinking about the humanities and the arts, one of the critical things that we're struggling with at the moment is the question of assessment, right? So we're teaching, and in the form of teaching, we're then prescribing, the paper, the term paper, the semester paper that students have to turn in. But the rise of artificial intelligence programs means that students are now getting away with murder. And there are incredibly exciting debates that are happening globally around how do we intervene on the challenges that AI poses when it comes to sitting down and students conceptualizing and articulating their ideas and being assessed in the traditional format, right? Whether it's the sit-down written exam where students will again come into a massive hall, sit down, write an exam for 3 to 4 hours, or whether it is turning in a paper. How do we think about that in creative and innovative ways when there is artificial intelligence? And this became a real question in the wake of the pandemic, when teaching became interfaced with online modes, right?
Yes.
So we were no longer in the lecture theatre. We were no longer in person. Everything was online, and students took that for their advantage, right? To be like, okay, if I'm not in class and nobody's really kind of looking at me in terms of what I'm doing, I can kind of do whatever the hell I want to do. So how do we think about, and one of my colleagues at the University of Stellenbosch in the philosophy department there, Pilam Simang, says, well, we need to be thinking about the role of sitting down and assessing students, in more creative and innovative ways using the spoken word. So, example, a student can come in for an assessment and instead of a written exam, rather give, which would kind of look like a preparatory format for the oral defense.
Sure.
Right? Sure. And so I guess my question sort of is centering around that, to say, in the context of artificial intelligence, in the context of literacies, right? Because, as you say, we want to appreciate the culture as well as the richness that our students are bringing from their cultural specificities and their contexts. How do we factor in assessment in all of this? And I am posing this question because of your particular role in education and having had thought about these kinds of questions as well in your work.
Yes, I think that to kind of get around the workaround, the artificial intelligence, is to have one-on-one conversations. Again, is it effective? Is it efficient? And then it becomes very subjective. How do I evaluate someone's
competence.
Competency. What do I do? Is there a rubric that I use to measure your oracy and how you answered a question? Because one would hope, unless there's, again, something that everybody's memorizing, and then we would figure that out pretty quickly. What are the authentic answers, and how are the variations on an acceptable? What is the range of acceptability within those oral answers? And it takes a heck of a long time.
Yeah, because how much do you allocate to a single student that you're going to be examining in that way?
So everybody has 10 minutes. All right, so if I'm a visual learner and oral presentations are really hard for me, am I at a disadvantage because that's just kind of like not the way I communicate well?
Okay.
And so we can have the students, we can all just be bots, and we can have students handing in AI papers and professors using AI to grade. And then the computers will just talk to each other, and I'm not exactly sure what happens in the middle.
Yeah.
I'm hoping, but things are so high stakes. It's the case. It's just, if things weren't so high stakes, then people would be willing to make mistakes and willing to play around with language and play around with the assessments. But, because things are so high stakes, then people try to find these other ways to do well, not because they want to do well, and they want to be seen as competent and confident.
Yes. And where does the high stakes component come in? Is it the financial responsibility of having to read at a university? Is it, this is my gateway ticket out, right? This degree that I'm reading for.
Exactly.
Is it, so where is this kind of pressure coming from? And again, and I think maybe this is a bit of a digressing move, but I'm curious about this, which is to say, and this is a challenge that I think both the United States as well as South Africa are confronted by. What happens in the context where we are producing graduates, but those graduates aren't being absorbed by the market, right? So there is a challenge of articulation, if one can call it that, right? Whereby we're producing skills, but the market says these aren't the skills that are required for what we need in terms of a professional, an individual who's employable, et cetera. So is it that cluster of complexity that gives us the high stakes? Is it a question of reputability, right? Are we going to be seen to be doing a good job if we take this particular route and we know that this is not necessarily, this is something new, it's not something that's been tried and tested? I'm trying to wrap my head around the concept of the high stakes in the system, whether it be in K through 12 or university education.
I think in K through 12, there are markers, and there are different, we have foundation phase, and then we have upper primary. So, to kind of get from one point to another, you have to pass these exams.
For sure.
And then when you get past post-secondary, then there are exams to get into colleges and universities. There are exams for teachers. There are exams for plumbers. There are all these gateways that allow you to move into your profession. And if you don't make it, then there's a lot of self-concept involved, as well as social perception, and so that's, I think, what makes it high stakes, for sure.
And in relation then to coming back to the conversation, I want to take us maybe to the work of Zoë Wicomb, right? One of the individuals who. And again, I think I'm broaching this particular subject because I'm relying on your familiarity with the South African context, right? Specifically when it comes to literacy work, right? So Zoë Wicomb does a really, really interesting essay in 1995. We're just at the cusp of it's democracy is new. It's a new thing, right? And she's conceptualizing how South African democracy will play itself out in relation to what we've seen, right, in terms of the divestment from, for instance, black schools. Again, a history that we share quite similarly with the United States, right, where black schools have not received as much attention as white schools, for example. And she says, so arguments for the inherent qualities of literacy have been contested, however, right? Ruth Finnegan, in her study of the Limba people of Sierra Leone, analyzes the ways in which their oral literature indeed functions as a vehicle for objectivity and abstract thought, and remarks on its concern with the metalingual and reflexivity in storytelling. Would you agree with her when she concludes that what passes for literacy is none other than the social conventions of the dominant class rather than universal logic? And if we agree with her or if we disagree with her, on what grounds do we do that work?
When we think about the funds of knowledge that people bring, they bring their culture, they bring storytelling, they bring oracy, they bring literacy. And we want to acknowledge them and celebrate them and value them. And we want the keepers of that knowledge to value them. When we start moving into education, organized education, then we're relying basically on reading and writing and building those skills. We want to, with the reports, and there's a Breadth of Knowledge that Save the Children report just came out. I was in a webinar this week around these 21st century skills. So you refer to them at the beginning of the question about, this idea of collaboration, critical thinking, being able to work with each other, problem solve. And so those are more the skills that we're looking for in this knowledge age, moving in from the agrarian age to the industrial age to the knowledge age. And so that's going to give our workers more value and currency and also self-efficacy. So it feels like we're going a little bit full circle. So we're going back to those funds of knowledge of community and working collegiality and working together cooperatively. But so that's all well and good, but we still need to have those, quote, foundational skills. So it's great to have critical thinking, but not so great if you can't read.
For sure.
In order to think critically about what's being proposed. So we still kind of bounce back to, where are we, how are we defining literacy, how are we defining competency as we move through into the knowledge age. We have to have both.
For sure, absolutely.
We have to have both. We can't, we have been trying to function with, one person on one screen, but now as we've seen, and the pandemic has really highlighted, we can have community, need to have community, should have community, whether we're in person or on screen.
For sure. Thank you, Pamela, for that response. And I think it takes me to necessarily the complexity of, and I'm, a higher education practitioner, so I haven't necessarily been in the classroom in the sense of the school setting, but, I've been in the lecture theatre. And one of the critical questions that I'm constantly concerned with or concerned about is how not only do we portray what it means to be literate within the university space, but how that intersects with privileging particular ways of knowledge and seeing that certain students bring in to the classroom or into the lecture theatre from the training that they have received in their schooling, right? Which is, as I say earlier on, it's what I conceptualize to be an unfair disadvantage, right? So for a kid to come through an elite private school, get to the university context, and that's the kind of knowledge that we're still privileging. And a couple of my colleagues, think through this particular problem, and I'm curious about how, as a higher education practitioner who also has experience with being in the United States schooling system, as an administrator, how you perceive this particular challenge that they're diagnosing, which is exactly what we can conceptualize to be the hidden curriculum,
Yes.
right? So the kinds of literacies that we want exhibited in the university, the kinds of literacies that we privilege, and how that in your historical background as an education practitioner, how you've seen that working out to either challenge maybe or perpetuate certain socioeconomic and sociocultural realities in society, right? So I'm curious about that, to say, how do we, number one, challenge and destabilize the ingrained conceptions of what we think or what we see to be quote unquote valuable knowledge versus knowledge that is quote unquote invaluable. And I'm asking this, precisely in the context of that paper that our colleagues did, Rethinking the Teaching of Academic Literacy in the Context of Calls for Curriculum Decolonization. And that paper came out in 2020. So what we're beginning to see, right, whether it's in the South African context, whether it is in the New Zealand context, in the United Kingdom contexts, where we have heard calls for decolonization coming up, is this move to kind of reconceptualize what it means to know. And part of this conversation, what I'm observing as part of this conversation, is you're struggling, from my assessment, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, with the value of the written assessment and what it does for us in terms of being able to give a standardized test that is efficient, that works, versus the project of imagining anew what education could look like in order to still produce competent, qualified teachers, plumbers, architects, accountants, lawyers, doctors, right? So I guess my question is a laden question. The first part being, does the knowledge and literacies that we privilege as universities perpetuate certain historical inequalities? That's the first part. And then the second part of the question then is it possible? And I think, as an experienced practitioner, as my senior, in as much as indeed we are colleagues, but as my senior colleague, how do we, am I too ambitious? Are we, the younger generation, too ambitious when we propose, think about reimagining how we have privileged certain knowledge as a form of trying to address the socio-inequalities that we're identifying in our society?
Well, I'll start at the end. No, you're not. We need to have visionaries. We need to have this need to change, this want to change, this desire to change, in order for us to examine critically what we've been doing, how we've been doing, and how sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally perpetuated these systemic inequities. So when we're looking at primary education, K through 12 education, we prepare teachers, but we always go back to what we know, how we were educated. And so that becomes somewhat of the hidden curriculum in terms of, all right, these are the standards that we have. And in the United States, they're by state, not by the country. And then how do we meet those standards, and what materials do we use to meet those standards? And those become culturally ingrained. So there is the canon.
Yes.
Used to be, in the United States, a lot of dead white men. Now there are still some of the dead white men being brought along, but we're getting more diversity in terms of gender and ethnic identity and language, so that are becoming more part of the canon. But the preparation of teachers has to catch up with that. So that we are preparing teachers to be able to teach that canon, the new canon, rather than the canon that they perhaps came through school knowing. And so there's this kind of cognitive dissonance within the higher education, especially with teacher preparation, of, all right, no, that wasn't wrong, and you're not a bad person, and you learned critical thinking skills. Now, how do we apply these critical thinking skills to this new literature, to this new canon? And so we're having to think about what teacher preparation looks like and how it broadens and expands. Well, I have to teach Shakespeare. Well, why do you have to teach Shakespeare? What is it in Shakespeare that you're teaching? Is it the conflicts? Is it the character development? Is it the use of language? All right, so that's the it. So how do we apply characterization, use of language, conflict in this new piece of literature, new to you? So I think that will help us broaden the funds of knowledge of both our teachers and our learners, and help them the learners move through the educational system feeling a little bit better about themselves, because hopefully they're seeing themselves reflected in the new canon. The books that they're reading, the topics that they're writing about, and so that makes it more expansive. So yes, we do need the push to rethink what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, but always, I think, with that common goal that we want people to be readers and writers and want to read and write, not just, okay, I'm doing this because I have to, because that doesn't get you very far. And so sometimes when we're looking at standards and we're looking at statewide assessments or national assessments, then it's very transactional. And I did that, I'm never going to do that again. And that's not really preparing us to use our 21st century skills.
For sure. And it reminds me actually of what we had, I think they still have them, the national benchmark tests back in South Africa. That was, so basically you take that test and then you it tells you where you're going to go, right? Which stream you're going to take, whether you're going to be in the humanities and social sciences.
It's the Harry Potter sorting hat.
Exactly, right? I like that concept. It truly was. And I remember taking that test. And after I took the test, I remember thinking, okay, I've done that. I'm never going to do that again, right? And only later in my life do I begin to, as I'm growing in terms of my own teacher identity as a higher education practitioner, do I begin to realize, all right, this is what that test was for. But again, it's that question of how do we do it in such a way that it resonates with the person who's taking the test, right? That not only is the content of the test relevant to their lives, but also it's not just, this is a 4-hour thing that you have to sit through and that's that, right? There needs to be sort of some sense of applicability of this knowledge to their lives. And I guess this brings me, back to that earlier question that I had asked around the socio-political inequality that our institutions tend to perpetuate, right? And what I am seeing in the United States is something very similar to what we've got back at home, because to a certain extent, what the United States has done very well for all its good and bad is that you folks have exported democracy and its institutional cultures, or its cultural institutions, right? So
exported, or people have imported it. We could,
for sure.
It's a little bit.
It's a give and take.
Yeah.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you on that. And what we've seen in the developing world is the importation of the cultural institutions. And what that has done, for example, is that our universities, you go to a university in Brazil, you go to a university in Chile, you go to a university in South Africa, in Malawi, in Kenya, and you go to a university in the United States, you're basically in the same institution. It's staffed by different people. The language might be different. The architecture might slightly differ depending on when that institution was founded. But you're reading the exact same stuff. It's exactly the same discourse. It's the exact same managerialism. It's the exact same corporatization of of that institution, it's the same thing. And everybody is, clamoring to be on the global rankings, whether they are the Schengen rankings, whether it's the Times higher education rankings, or whatever the hell you want to, whichever ranking system you want to use. And what that has meant is that our societies have kind of created these institutions whereby South Africa will have its equivalents of its Harvards, of its Yales, of its Princetons, similarly with Chile, similarly with India, et cetera, et cetera. All of these countries will have the equivalents of those institutions. And the people who come out of those institutions are people who hold power in that society, perpetuating historical inequalities. And I wonder then, again, I'm fascinated. I'm personally very fascinated by what the function of the university is in challenging and destabilizing those realities. And Ali Mazrui did this in that book of his, Political Values and the Educated Elite in Africa, that book that came out in 1978. He thought about what is the function of higher education on the African continent. And so as we kind of do the work of grappling with what it means to still produce the competent and qualified professional, how do we take this institution and create of this institution an institution that creates a better world? Because supposedly that's what a university is supposed to do, right?
Yes,
it's supposed to attend to social needs.
Well, attending to the social needs is so intricately tied to the economic needs. And so if the university is providing economic upward mobility, then it seems to perpetuate itself. It's almost a closed loop. Okay, this is our goal. We're achieving our goal. Let's keep doing it some more. And so we need to think about, what are the outcomes of this educational institution, and who is it serving? So is it, is the 1% just staying the 1%, and the economic and social divide gets wider? And if so, then we need to rethink who's getting access to university and how are they getting access to university. Is it an economic barrier that's keeping the doors closed? Is it an educational barrier? And if we think about it, is it educational preparation? Then we kind of cycle back to what's happening in the K-12 or R-12 space. And how do we change that? And why do we change that? Do we change it so that we will be better prepared to get into the elite universities? Or do we want to have this synergy between changing what's expected at the university level that then can allow the R through 12 system be a little bit more creative, be different, and be more equitable?
Because I think part of it is, and I don't know what the situation looks like in the United States, but one of the critical challenges that we're facing in the South African context is a very exclusionary K through 12 system, right? You have your private schools that are producing the kind of learner who gets admission into a Stellenbosch, into a UCT, into a Wits University, into a Rhodes University, right? And these are seen to be the top leading institutions of the country, research intensive, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm often concerned, I'm a product of these institutions, by the way, and I'm often concerned by what that means, because I don't think one of the exciting things that I think happens as a result of the kind of conversation that we're having today is a sharing of experiences, right? So you folks in the United States don't necessarily see the impact of these social structures and institutions because of the economic cushion that exists, right?
For whom?
for the general population, I would say maybe. I don't know.
Globally, but there are some people who would, in the United States, who would say, I don't have a cushion. I may not even have a pillowcase.
I am dangling without a safety net underneath. But what I don't know how I'm finding it fascinating though is that it doesn't translate maybe in the same ways, maybe because of the histories of the two countries. But that safety net that's missing for the poor doesn't translate, for example, to public protests happening on the streets. It doesn't translate to various social ills, right, that come up as a result of people being unemployed, being unemployable, and the economy not having the capacity to absorb individuals in the very first instance, right? So I think that those are the differences, right, between the two contexts. And so I think the United States will wake up to the challenges of the corporatized university a lot later than, for example, what we've seen, say, in Malawi, or what we're beginning to see in South Africa, and what we've seen, for example, in Kenya, right, where you've got graduates coming out of the system and graduates are disillusioned, right, which means that young people and the continent has a burgeoning young population. It is globally, it's the highest youth population in the world.
Yes.
And I think that's creating a bit of a Molotov cocktail for us, right, on the continent.
In what way?
Young people they're fed up. Pamela, they're fed up.
With not being able to, of getting in, of either not getting into university or getting into university, graduating from university, and then what?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right? And of course, there, a senior administrator in South Africa, Zeblon Vilakazi, he just recently took over from Adam Habib, who is now at SOAS, and he's now leading Wits University. And Vilakazi says something that was quite interesting. He says to us when he takes over, I want to create a Wits University, the MIT of Africa. Right. I know.
Okay.
Strange. Exactly. And part of what he was trying to get at was to say he wants Wits University to be the center for innovation. All right?
All right.
But the problem, of course, is that in creating of Wits University a center for innovation or an institution of innovation, you're kind of pegging yourself against an MIT that is addressing exceptionally different sociopolitical conditions, is situated in a very, very different sociocultural context and milieu. And as a result, you're importing a blueprint to, it's exactly what happened, for example, with the structural adjustment programs in the 70s and 80s, where it's like, oh, here's a model that works, take it, copy and paste, and we saw the problems with that. So young people I'm often concerned by the kind of institution, and my scholarship is kind of thinking about this to say, what's the difference between a university in South Africa versus a South African university?
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And part of that goes into questions of governance, right? And part of the questions of governance relate to assessment, relate to pedagogy, relate to the kinds of perspectives or ideas that, that we exhibit as faculty and as faculty administrators, as faculty leaders, and just as ordinary members of faculty. And so I guess the question that I was getting at was to say, how do you perceive that disarticulation in the United States? Is it even there? And I think to a certain extent you've kind of answered it by saying that there are certain people who say, well, I don't have the safety net. I don't even have a pillowcase, let alone a cushion, right? And again, I'm pressing the question not only with you, but with a number of my guests as well, whereby we're thinking about, well, what is it that we're what is it about this cultural institution that is the university that needs changing?
Well, you've mentioned Vitz wanting to be, the MIT, and then you get a little heebie-jeebie about that. But when explained as the center of innovation, then I can get on board with that. Because hopefully it will be innovation for South Africa. So it'll be a South African university. And what does South Africa need? And how are we positioned to innovate and create around those needs and prepare people to meet those needs so that when they come through our university, they will have their basic skills, they'll have their 21st century skills, and they will have jobs when they leave. And so I think that's kind of what we want to look at in terms of the role of the university, is to kind of have that pipeline. And then in order to get into university, or once one's in university, I think that will shape and influence what's happening below. So it'll be like a trickle-down effect of, okay, this is what education looks like at university. In order to be prepared, then this is what secondary education needs to look like, and then this is what upper primary and reception and foundation phase needs to look like. And so we have that hopefully positive trickle-down effect of, all right, then we are going to value the funds of knowledge. We're going to think about 21st century skills in foundation phase. We're going to think about basic skills and 21st century skills all the way through, so that the pipeline is expanded. The entrance requirements or the ideal candidates for university hopefully will change and be more inclusive and have more breadth than that it has currently now. And then we will see some innovation that will be contextually appropriate. That bringing MIT. I'm not saying that people shouldn't aspire, but bringing MIT has its own problems. Harvard has its own problems. It's I guess familiarity may breed a little contempt, but thinking about your question of a university in South Africa versus South African university, I think that to make that change, that would be a really significant pivot for higher education, and would have very broad implications for the whole educational system.
Exactly. Not only in the context of a given country, but globally as well, right? Because in our ability to pay attention to the site specificities of our contexts, we can be able to genuinely innovate and then share those innovations with the world.
Yes.
Right? So there's this idea of locally responsive, globally relevant, right? And I think part of it is, I wanted to pick up on the question of, maybe familiarity breeds contempt. I don't necessarily think so, right? As an outsider, one picks up quite quickly that, okay, these are some of the challenges. There's the augustness, there's the prestige that comes with looking in from the outside, but once you get in, you begin to appreciate the complexity of the institution as it operates on a daily basis. But in this ability to be site-specific and responsive to the site-specific, but also being globally responsive, or relevant rather, I'm curious about a transcontinental, intercontinental conversation, right? And for both its challenges in terms of the critiques that we can level against such a project, but also for the opportunities that it presents. So for the challenges, to give an example, what South Africa did, I think it was after we adopted Curriculum 2005, we went and we adopted the outcomes-based education model from the Australians. And what that did is that it failed us completely and dismally, right? And so there have been these kind of iterative approaches in the South African education system quite consistently, with one of our colleagues, kind of suggesting that at UCT, that what we've done is that we've kind of done a full circle, right? We started off with a very, very teacher-focused curriculum. We said, okay, let's open that up, curriculum 2005, outcomes-based education. You know, we were saying, okay, let's open it up and be student-centered or learner-centered rather. That didn't quite work out for us because our learners we didn't appreciate as an education system the knowledges that our learners were bringing into the classroom. So we had a conception of what is the knowledge bank of an autonomous learner, right? And that knowledge bank speaks to a very particular identity that has very particular histories in our country. And then we said, okay, cool, that's not working, and we now kind of have gone back to a very, very teacher-centered curriculum, the national curriculum, CAPS, curriculum.
An assessment.
Yes, right, where it's very, very rigidified. So those would be the challenges. But what are the opportunities, maybe, of the intercontinental conversation in terms of transcontinental conversation to say, these are some of the challenges or the problems that we're facing. Because I think globally, there are particular communities that are always at the receiving end of a failing education system. And those are usually under-resourced Black communities or othered, marginalized communities, right? Under-resourced schools, underpaid teachers. The problems are countless. But I wonder if there's an opportunity in that, right, to kind of say, let's take seriously what it means to share the experiences, both where we are winning, in terms of where we're getting it right, and both where we're not winning. And do you see that as something that's a possibility?
Well, I hope it is a possibility. It should be a possibility. And as we think about some of the more, globally oriented reports, from UNESCO, from Save the Children in their various countries, I think that we do need to share the successes and challenges globally. And this global perspective does, again, bring us back to multiliteracies. Like, people are multilingual in a lot of these countries. And how does that complicate the development of skills? Or how should we be looking at it in a more nuanced way? That it may take a little bit longer, because the learners are thinking in 2 or 3 languages. As a school principal, I was in a school that had a French immersion program, and it had a foreign language in the elementary school, so they had Spanish. And I had a 5th grader, and he was lovely. And, his 5th grade teacher was really worried about him because he was slow to answer any queries. And I happened to get to know him for behavioral reasons, but he was a really nice child. And I found out that he spoke Haitian Creole at home. During the summer, he was sent to Canada so he would learn French. He was in a school where English was a language of instruction. And he was learning Spanish 3 times a week. Give the kid a break. He's hearing your question in English, and he's sifting through 4 languages. And
processing, how do I respond?
Okay, I know, I hear it, I know English, but what does this word mean? Do I know this word in English? Do I know this word in French? Do I know this word in Haitian Creole? If I know in Haitian Creole, what does it sound like? So there's, and so they wanted to have him have an education plan, and I said, no, there's nothing wrong with his brain. His brain is probably better than yours, teacher, because how many languages do you speak? So I think that we need to look at that and value the multilingual populations, and that it may, how we teach and how we assess may be different. And it's also around teacher preparation, because are we empowering teachers who share the same mother tongue, home language, with their learners, so that they really can provide a rich oral and written curriculum, and meet those goals, because the learners will be better at learning a written language from the language that they speak. They know the syntax, they know the context, they know the words. They just have to figure out what they look like when they translate it into reading. So I think that's those are important issues, and all of these globally, these different countries are dealing with this multilingualism.
No, absolutely. And it reminds me of the work of Chrissy Bowie and Sue McKenna, right, when they talk about powerful knowledge, which is what, if we're thinking about, for instance, how we then develop and produce knowledge in the university, we build it on these building blocks of knowledge, of powerful knowledge, and access to that powerful knowledge. And I'm always confronted by the question of, in granting students this kind of epistemic access that you're talking about, right? So saying to students, okay, we take seriously the fact that you're a person who's coming to the space with 4 languages already, right? And are constantly negotiating and navigating, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's on the playground, you're constantly navigating which language to use. Is it possible that, for instance, in Haitian Creole, we have quote-unquote powerful knowledge? And I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier, to say, okay, you're teaching Shakespeare. Why are you teaching Shakespeare, right? What's the premise for bringing Shakespeare into the classroom? Is it because of the themes that he's exploring? Is it because of the moral questions that he's asking? If that's the case, can we find that in a contemporary rendition, for instance, of a Haitian Creole text? But what would it mean, or what would it look like? Now, this is the imaginative part, right? What would it look like? I think the learner would be incredibly appreciative to see themselves represented in the classroom in that moment, because this is a space where we're engaging with high stakes of knowledge, right? This is revered knowledge that is in this space. And for them to see a text in Haitian Creole would be a, oh my gosh, my people actually can do this as well. My people
Exactly.
can, like I am legitimate in and of myself to be in this space.
It's very affirming. It's very, very affirming, very culturally affirming. I think that that's important.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking of the creativity around that, right? In the sense of, how do we, as I'm sitting here, for example, I'm competent in at least 4 languages as I'm sitting here, right? And I'm thinking, if I were to, for example, give a class give a seminar in, the philosophy department here at Harvard, and I were to then say, okay, I'm bringing in parts of that knowledge, whether there is a student who is aware of some of those languages or not, how does that play itself out, right, in the classroom, without being met with the resistance of, we don't know this, and the people, by the way, whose hegemonic identity is at the center, have incredible power, whether they are students or faculty, to say, we don't know this, we don't like this, we don't want this. So how does one negotiate that, right? That recognition of those marginal identities as they come into our lecture theatres, into our classrooms from the students, taking those seriously, and then responding to the resistances, if one can call them that, of taking those identities seriously.
In the K-12 space, I'm assuming that you're talking about taking, for example, a Haitian Creole author, but it would be translated into English. But just seeing the cultural context in which the literature was based, and seeing some of the familiar turns of phrase, even though they might be translated, would be very affirming. And yes, there's literature, deep literature, important literature in all languages. But we do tend to, again, be very hegemonic about, what counts. Yeah, that's nice. And when we have a little extra time on Friday afternoon, we'll get around to it. If you're good, if you behave, we'll have extra time on Friday and we'll do this. And it's very much, I don't know, it's not even icing on the cake. It's probably the cherry on the top that kind of gets, pushed off very easily. And there are children for whom that's important, and that was an opportunity. So I think that that's important. I think that being able to express oneself in writing and including when they get to a turn of phrase, again, this is back to translanguaging, being able to put in a word or a phrase within their, quote, English composition that is of another language. That's because, for many reasons, it could be because I don't know how to say this in English, but it's essential to what I want to express, so I'm just writing it. Or I'm writing about a character and I'm writing about a situation in which this language was happening, and so to be true to my characters, I'm using their language. Or this is the word, this is the turn of phrase that really expresses what I would want to express. And if I put it in English, it gets lost in translation. It doesn't have the power. It doesn't have the efferent aspect of my creativity and my how I want this to sound. So we need to help teachers accept that facility and that use of languages, within the classroom. Yes, we are moving, in the United States, toward, passing these tests in English, but at least along the way, we are acknowledging funds of knowledge. We are acknowledging multilingualism as an asset and not as a deficit.
And I think as a way of concluding our discussion, you've intimated at this, in different parts of the conversation, teacher education, right?
Yes.
And the importance that teacher education plays in preparing the right kind of person who will be able to hold that diversity in the classroom and who will be able to appreciate and understand where it's coming from. I don't know if you're familiar with that text by Jonathan Jansen, Knowledge in the Blood.
No, I'm not.
It was a very beautiful book. I personally quite enjoy it. And I used it actually when I taught a course on education research methodologies at the University of Pretoria a couple of years ago. And what Jansen does there is that, he talks to what he articulates as post-conflictual pedagogies. So you have a deeply fractured society on the premise of race. And he then says, and part of what motivated him to do that book was that he was at the very same faculty that I was teaching at the University of Pretoria in the early 2000s. And he was constantly met with, whether it was from as dean of the faculty, whether it was his staff, whether it was his students, folks who would question having a black dean in a historically white, historically Afrikaner institution that privileges a particular kind of person, body, being in authority, right? And he writes about this, and what he says is that what we need to do in teacher education, teacher training programs is to allow our teachers to sit with what it means to have difference in their classroom and not to be afraid of that difference, and to embrace that difference, because sometimes it comes up in very, very violent ways, right? Where you will have a student who will lash out because they feel unseen
Yes.
in the classroom, right? And so I wonder if you would have, some thoughts around what it means then for us to be deliberate in specifically teacher trainers, what it means to be deliberate about the kind of teacher that we're training and producing. Because that person has an incredible impact on the lives of the children who will step into their classroom and who will pass through that classroom and elect either to go on with their education or say, you know what, if this is how I'm going to be treated and if this is how the system is going to interact with me, I'd rather go the route of delinquency, I'd rather go the route of a social dropout and just basically fall off the face of the earth kind of thing. So how do we sensitize? Is there a possibility of sensitizing our teachers to be more aware of the role and impact that they have on learners? And how do teacher trainers kind of get to that awareness of the person who is graduating from this program will have an incredible sense of impact?
First and foremost, I think teaching is a vocation and an avocation. You have to really love it to be able to do it. And then, second of all, I think that good teachers are prepared to think about their assumptions. Who are they? What is their culture? What is their language background? And how does that affect how they look at knowledge? We haven't gotten to the knowledge yet. We're just looking at, what is knowledge and how do I interact with it? And then start to think about, all right, well, so what does this look like for my learners? What funds of knowledge do they bring? And how can I take this text that I'm told to teach, and get engagement? And so there may be a curriculum and there may be text that one, the canon that one has to teach, but we can talk with the text, but we can also talk back to the text and highlight some of the assumptions that the author is making, some of the interactions that the characters are having, and then turn it around and say, how's that working for you, learner? Do you know people like this? If you don't know people, what would people in your situation problem solve around this conflict, so that you are again bringing in that cultural sensitivity, that use of language, that use of knowledge, and using that to interrogate a text rather than saying, this is the text, this is what the author meant, and this is what you need to know about it. I mean, I used to think when I was in high school, like, there was this secret, book in the back of their teacher's heads that they told me what this poem meant. Okay, if you say so, that's not what I'm seeing, but if you say so, then I need to get on with the program. And my sense of agency was totally squashed. But if we can build teacher preparation so that, yes, we have standards, yes, there are going to be tests, but then how do we bring in this divergent thinking and accept and encourage the divergent thinking and have discussion and debate within the classroom among the learners so that they get to see multiple perspectives.
For sure.
And they get to understand multiple and have to use documentation, go back to the text and say, I think this because in the text,
this is what we find.
This is what this sentence means this to me, not I think that the sky is purple.
Okay, but why?
And as my father would say, down a token will get you on the train. Like, okay, where in the text? Where what is leading? So then we are building not only the basic skills, but we're building the 20th century skills. We're building the critical thinking. We're bringing the collaborative. We're bringing the problem solving. We're bringing multiple perspective taking. And so if we can bring our teacher preparation into that type of learning and pedagogy, then they will be able to enact it in the classroom.
Absolutely. Pamela, I'm so grateful for your time and for, having this conversation. I think I walk away from this conversation with so much more to think about, for a number of reasons. The first of which is the fact that I am a young academic. And I think part of what we tend to forget is the question of what are the assumptions that I am bringing into the lecture theatre. And I, having had been at Harvard for a while, I am fascinated by how people approach their pedagogy here. I am incredibly fascinated, and sometimes even shocked, if I'm being honest, and sometimes even shocked. And I guess, and this is the final question, and I'll wrap it up. But I'm wondering about, and this is where the shock comes from.
Yes, I was wondering what the shock was.
The shock comes from a certain sense of pedagogic responsibility. And how sometimes I see colleagues, because we are under the assumption that everybody who's here is incredibly smart and incredibly intelligent and part of the work that is becoming integral to the professional identity of an academic in South Africa is what we are conceptualizing as higher education studies and critical theory in higher education studies, which necessarily implies a certain level of pedagogic responsibility. Right. So you can't check out and say, you're an adult, I'm here to teach you, and whether or not there are certain tensions, collisions in the project of doing that work is neither here nor there, right? And sometimes I have walked away from some of the teaching that I have encountered with that sense of abdication of responsibility from some of the colleagues. And, I wonder, and these are some of these colleagues are young academics. So it's not to say, because I think that there is a certain sense of professional identity shifts with us younger scholars. And sometimes we tend to just want to be like, well, that's not my problem. Whereas with the older...
I taught it. You have to learn it.
Whereas with the older generation, as you say, teaching was, whether you're a professor or you're a school teacher, teaching was a vocation. It is a vocation. And I think sometimes what we've done, maybe, as academics, what we're doing is that it's a profession. We're professionalizing it. It's no longer vocational work. I'm an expert, and I am not here to carry you through any visceral reactions maybe that you might be having to a particular concept, to particular content. I'm just here to do my job, and then after that I'll go and I'll do my research and present good papers and I think that's what I sometimes. It's not across the board, but when it does pop up, I am alarmed by it. And so I guess the point that I'm just getting to is the fact of pedagogic responsibility. And as a seasoned academic and intellectual, what advice would you give to a young academic today around this notion of pedagogic responsibility, whether it is someone who is in biochemistry, whether it's someone who's in economics, whether it's someone in history, whether it's someone in philosophy? What would you say to that academic who says, I'm an expert and I am teaching on the premise of the expertise that I have, irrespective of the pedagogic obligation that I might have toward my students in the lecture theatre?
I think my question first would be, why are you teaching? And if it's because the knowledge that I have is important and it needs to be extended, then the pedagogy is important because you need the learners to learn the content, but also to mess around with it. You know, and I always tell my students, we are a community of learners. You're going to learn from me. I'm going to learn from you. You're going to learn from each other. And you know, within the one thing I have to say about Harvard is that we do focus on pedagogy. There's a vice provost who's in charge. You know, we have teaching and learning, a lot of seminars. We have webinars. At the School of Education, we observe each other, give each other feedback. And our students think that it's the funniest thing. And you know, but look, if we're gonna talk the talk, we need to walk the talk. And so if we're trying to teach, prepare you to be 21st century educators, then we need to be 21st century educators. And to think about, you know, as the young academics is like, who's doing the work, who's doing the talking within any particular class, and is there productive struggle? You know, that teaching and assessing is not, again, the sorting hat. We've got the high flyers and the vultures. No, we all want to move the tide raises all boats, and we want to figure out, you know, which configuration and which interactions will engage all of the learners within the class. And sometimes that's providing, you know, small group discussions, large group discussions, online discussions, because we will have people who are shy and have really good ideas, just kind of can't get it out fast enough, or they're shy about it. You know, so providing those multiple opportunities to engage with productive struggle.
And I love that, because I think especially that first question is so important. Why are you teaching? It is so crucial and so important. And I think it is a great note to end our discussion today. And for a lot of our viewers as well to kind of consider that question, to say, what is the function of higher education, of the university? And in answering that question, what I'm getting is that boils down to how you answer the personal question of why am I engaged in knowledge production, knowledge dissemination through teaching.
Yes.
Right. Folks, join us next time on the Black Archive Visual Podcast when we are joined by another guest, where we will be thinking critically about culture as it intersects with the institution of education. And I'm quite excited for this particular segment of the podcast series, because we are thinking quite critically with a number of seasoned and incredibly well-experienced academics around what it means to invent a higher education institution that is responsive to 21st century needs. I am Zoë Wicomb, your host, and I look forward to welcoming you to the next episode. See you soon.